Section 16 of the Soul or Rational Psychology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Travis Bissell. The Soul or Rational Psychology by Emanuel Swedenborg. Translated by Frank Sewall, 1837 to 1915, and others. Section 16. 11. Intellect, thought, reasoning, and judgment. The human intellect. 140. There is no thought without imagination, because there can be none without the ideas of memory, which are as much parts of thought as of the imagination, since without memory we cannot think. It is therefore very hard to perceive distinctly what imagination is and what thought is. That they are so distinct from each other and can be distinguished appears in the case of somnambulists, who see with eyes open and with a sort of imagination, but often a perverted one because there is no thought in it. Then again, from brute animals, who are not without imagination, even if they are without thought. Also from those just out of infancy, who begin to prattle and speak things imagined, but not things thought. Many adults even being like them, varying in their capacity of thought and fancy. But because there is imagination in thought, and thought in imagination, we believe thought to be a certain more perfect and refined imagination, supposing that these could not be separated, as was said. It is important, therefore, to inquire more thoroughly what the one is and what the other. 141. Imagination is only a superior and internal sight. It is exerted when we reproduce single objects in that order in which they have been seen, as a palace or edifice with all its external and internal structure, then also its other furnishings, even to the very masters and servants who inhabit it, without any other connection and order than were observed in the sight and hearing. It is the same with the cities, provinces, and kingdoms which we have visited. These the internal sight or imagination observes collectively, while the eye observes them successively. Then also the human body itself and its single viscera and parts, their position and connection, and finally their whole anatomy. So in other things, as in the several practical sciences, mechanics, experimental physics, astronomy, also in theoretical sciences, so far as we have learned and retained these by memory. Therefore, imagination is the reproduced memory of things seen and heard, and a simultaneous intuition of them without any further progression into those things which have not yet been grasped by the sense. 142. Thought, indeed, does not rest content in the reproducing of mere ideas of the memory or of the imagination, or in viewing at the same time objects which have been successively brought before the external sight, but it goes farther. For from these, and from other similar things successively run through and represented, it gets hold of and brings out some new idea never before seen, and, indeed, it does this by means of a certain analysis, not unlike an analysis of infinites, as for instance by the laws of natural philosophy, and by a mode of reduction, of transposition, and of equation. This equation itself, formed by means of the mind alone, is called an idea of thought. Thus, an idea of the imagination is that which has been insinuated through the doors of the senses. But an idea of thought is that which is formed by the proper force of the mind from ideas of the imagination, resembling figures in a calculation. These ideas of thought, which are called rational, intellectual, and immaterial, once formed, however much compounded, are nevertheless regarded as simple ideas scarcely otherwise than as integral equations in algebra and integral analogies assumed for unity in geometry and arithmetic. The mind distributes and divides these, its own ideas, again into some other order or rational form, and thus deduces another analysis and equation from these. Hence arises a still more perfectly rational and intellectual idea. Thus thought is perfected and becomes more sublime and purer, and approaches nearer to pure intellect, and it ascends higher in that degree in which more ideas drawn into itself are assumed for simple ideas or truths, and as from these, arranged among themselves analytically, a still higher idea is elicited. In no other way can we be elevated to a knowledge of the pure intellectory, thus not by speech, or the use of words, or of ideas, or of the imagination. for its truths are more sublime than words, nor can they be expressed and laid bare except by such vocal forms as have been elevated and drawn up to them. 143. Such, therefore, is thought, from the description of which it is clear what difference there is between it and the imagination, as, for instance, that the ideas of thought are acquired by the mind itself, but the ideas of the imagination are only from the external senses, and that the thought can be perfected and exalted as it approaches nearer to pure intellect, but imagination is perfected only by experience of the senses, both its own and those of others. For whatever the symbols of the memory are, whether acquired through one's own senses, or through teachers, or through letters, or through tablets, all these are then ideas of the imagination, because they are of the memory alone, acquired through the senses. But they are so many parts and instrumental causes which the rational mind can make use of in order that thence it may form its own intellectual ideas and analyses. From this it follows that so much as we are able to understand, but do not understand, so much we hold in the memory, for the power of understanding lies in the memory. But from this potency alone no action follows. Therefore something else must be added in order that we may understand, and still more that we may acquire wisdom. 144. Thought, therefore, is a superior imagination, and as there is a superior imagination, so also there is a superior memory. The inferior memory is a memory of all particular things and of those ideas which are insinuated by way of the senses, both of sight and of hearing. But the superior memory is a memory of general and universal things and of all those ideas which are formed, and as it were created by means of the mind proper. These also impress themselves in our memory, just as if they were impressed on the sense. For when we think, the things thought and the results of these thoughts remain equally fixed. This memory, however, contains ideas rational, intellectual, and immaterial, while on the other hand, the inferior memory has only ideas of things purely natural and material. Therefore there is a memory of universals and a memory of singulars, and the former is of thought, but the latter of imagination. These memories, if we observe them more internally, are distinct from each other, for there can be a large memory of universals and a small memory of singulars, and vice versa. For the memory of universals comprehends in itself singulars which, as symbols of confirmation, can easily be drawn out, or can insinuate themselves. In order that singulars may be properly retained in their order by the memory, it is necessary that we form an idea of all universals, which is called their reason. From this order of the memory, singulars may be drawn forth, as from a single general rule and knowledge of calculation, as in arithmetic and algebra, yea, as also in other theoretical sciences, we can of ourselves educe an infinite number of specials and particulars. Thus we are able to run through in a moment an entire book containing nothing but examples of particulars, and to understand all, for the knowledge of universals can be compared with the sight, which from a tower or lofty mountain contemplates the entire region, and the city below, and the single objects in one view and glance, as it were. But he who walks about below, and in the streets, only comprehends certain parts successively, and thus scarcely one out of 1,000 of those things which the memory of universals comprehends in an instant. 145. Imagination, therefore, only takes in the form of an object, or of objects, and its quality, according to the order, the placing, and the connecting of the parts or of the ideas. But the thought draws forth not the material form itself of the parts, but out of such a form, or from similar forms collected together, it obtains a certain sense not in the visible parts and in the connection of the parts, but lying hidden within. Wherefore the thought is said to understand, and the imagination to perceive, and the idea of the thought is called immaterial, and the idea of imagination material. An intellection is an inmost sensation. 146. Thought can neither exist nor subsist, still less be perfected, without pure intellect. Pure intellect appears as though it flowed into the sphere of the thought to illuminate it by a certain light of intelligence. But there is no influx, for it is only a concurrence, a correspondence, or an established harmony, in which, indeed, there is a greater, better, and more perfect concurrence and correspondence in the degree that the thought is more elevated. But before plunging our thoughts deeper into these psychological mysteries, we ought to explain the meanings of the words themselves, or what is meant by understanding, judgment, thought, meditation, fancy, genius, and other terms. 147. Such is the progress and course of the human intellect. For truly what we hear we see, that which we see we perceive by an inmost sense, that which we perceive we understand, from things understood we think, from things thought we judge, from things judged we choose, from things chosen we conclude, from things concluded we will, and at length we act. This whole process is called the common intellect, in which the senses of hearing and seeing perform their own parts, but not the other senses, as smell, taste, and touch. The human intellect, or the intellect proper to man, consists in understanding, in thinking, in judging, in choosing, in concluding, in willing, and in acting accordingly. This whole course is, indeed, successively run through, but very often without the moments and degrees being observed. This velocity itself is called presence of mind, or according to others, the presence of the animus. But where the process is slower, it is called absence of mind and sluggishness. There can be presence of imagination without at the same time presence of intellect, and vice versa, for the one is distinct from the other, as noted above. He who promptly perceives singulars or takes them into the imagination, while the pure intellect promptly but slightly concurs, is called ingenious, and that faculty is called genius. But he who promptly understands those things which he perceives, while the pure intellect fully concurs, that is, who thinks sublimely and sees things in a way more harmoniously with the ideas or truths of the pure intellect, he is said to possess judgment, and that faculty is called judgment. Thus genius is the perfection of the imagination, but judgment is the perfection of thought. Or genius draws more from the imagination and the external senses, but judgment draws more from pure intellect. Hence genius is the characteristic quality of the intellect of animals, but judgment is that of the human intellect. Genius is common to boys, youths, the female sex, poets, and singers, but judgment is common to adults, the aged, men, philosophers. For with age judgment matures and increases, whereas genius decreases. To the most perfect judgment, not only the pure intellect, but also the soul, or spiritual intelligence, communicates and confers rays of its own light. The parts of the human intellect, or of thought, are called rational ideas, or simply reasons. When these are first brought together and turned about before a certain judgment is formed from them, we are said to ratiocinate, and the minor judgments which are formed from them are called ratiocinations. Genius, therefore, does not form judgments, but ratiocinations. When these ratiocinations are explained in speech, the whole act is called discourse. But let us treat more especially of the course and the series of the parts of the intellect properly human. 148. Understanding is a superior perception, and thus an inmost sensation. When, for instance, those things are understood which are perceived by an internal sight, I call it intellect because it is a sensation and a species of passion, as will be demonstrated below. 149. Thought closely succeeds perception, for when we call forth ideas of memory, one after another, particular and common, singular and universal, and others similar and contiguous, then that operation is properly called thought, or a turning and revolving of the mind toward every part or idea. More intense and constant thought fixed deeply on one object is called meditation. The state and habit of meditation is called fantasy. 150. When ideas or reasons are turned and revolved in thought, they are at length brought into the form of some equation, into which are brought all the analyses and rational analogies, scarcely otherwise than in the analytical calculus of infinites. This equation is called judgment, to which belonging merely those things referring to the matter proposed. The more perfect the form of the equation, and the more similar and harmonious the things to be found in it, so much the more perfect is the judgment. But it belongs to the pure intellect to perceive similarities, consistencies, harmonies, and truths. Hence, it is an exact judgment when the rational mind has called the purer intellect into closer intercourse. 151. It is from this analytical or rational equation, that is, from this judgment, that innumerable reasons and analogies are brought forward and collected. One reason is called forth after another in order, for that we may know what an algebraic equation contains in itself. One thing after another must be evolved, otherwise we perceive nothing distinctly, nor will the mind be able to determine or follow the particulars distinctly in act. This equation, therefore, must be resolved again before we can understand what it contains. The whole equation cannot be evolved at the same time, since its parts or analogies have entered into it successively and are in it simultaneously. These have therefore to be successively evolved. This operation is without a proper name, unless it may be called election, which being free coincides with free will, or with the liberty of willing and acting, for this will chooses freely, and thus concludes what is to be deduced from that rational equation, or from the judgment, and what is to be sent into the will. It may on this account be called the conclusion. The completion of all is the will. Following this and in it is determination, from whence arises action, and from the action the effect. But before it is concluded that anything must be sent from the intellect into the will, and from the will determined through an action, there will have to be present also the love or desire of a certain end. For this reason I have not been able to treat of the will until these loves and desires have been first considered. 152. This properly human intellect now described is called thought, and in what follows we shall make use of the word thought. The question then arises, how does thought operate? It appears from the description that it operates like the imagination, that is to say, by changing the state of the sensory or of the cortical gland. But there are common and particular, general, special, and individual, universal, and singular changes of the state of that sensory, and these which embrace particulars, individuals, and singulars are properly thoughts, for they are induced and formed by thought itself. Since the state thus formed, in order to embrace single particulars, at first obscurely but afterwards distinctly, is not a state of the imagination, for this is concerned only with particulars and singulars. That there are infinite states and infinite changes of state the mind can hardly conceive, or how many analogies, simple and compounded, there are, and how many series of analogies, or that these are capable of reduction one into another, but experience shows that these do exist, and are actually represented, and the very perfection of superior beings consists of this faculty of changing the state. Since, therefore, the cortical gland of the internal sensory can put on so many changes of state, it follows that the intellectory, or inmost cerebrum, that is, the simple cortex, must be able to produce still more, even to infinity. For example, let us take certain thoughts reduced to an equation or general formula. Then in this equation, as in a general or common state, there may be 1,000 analyses. Therefore, there must be a state for the common sensory which comprehends all distinctly. This is observed in speech itself and in writings. For one particular is adduced after another, and the more distinctly this is done, so much the more distinctly do they inhere in the equation or proposition. For we observe the singulars under a state common to all. This is so evident that by reflection alone we may see it to be true. 153. But as it has been said that pure intellect does not flow into the sphere of thoughts, but concurs with thoughts or with changes of state, it must now be explained in what way that act follows. First, let us get a clear idea concerning the form of the internal sensory or of the cortical gland, namely, that it is indeed the cerebrum in the smallest form, with its simple cortex and its simple medulla, like the large cerebrum, but more perfectly constructed. The change of state of the above-mentioned internal sensory itself is not able to affect any change of state in the intellectory or in the simple cortex, just as the change of state of the entire cerebrum does not change the state of any of its parts, but only the external state of the parts, that is, their position, their connection, and mutual relation. But since the external state agrees with the internal, or as the state of the parts cannot help being in agreement in some way with the internal states or with itself, it follows that the change of the external state announces and shows at once that there is a change of internal state and of what kind it is. While the internal state is rendered conscious of this change, it perceives at once what it means, precisely as the words of speech perceived by the hearing are turned immediately, as it were, into ideas as of things seen, not by influx, but by correspondence. For an idea can be expressed by another word and a different articulate sound, and still the same idea will recur, as whether we speak the same sentence in Greek, Latin, French, Italian, English, or Swedish. Still the same visual idea is presented. It is the use and culture, then, itself that causes that one idea corresponds to another. The same relation holds with the ideas of memory, of imagination, of thought, and of the pure intellect. An internal change of state of the sensory is an external change of state of the intellectory. But by use and experience, the intellectory perceives from this external change of state what such a change means. At once it concurs, and by its concurrence produces a corresponding idea of the pure intellect. Accordingly, the more universal, general, and common the changes of state is, so much the more distinctly is it perceived, as the essence and nature of the intellectory is thus more nearly reached. For all ideas are universal truths, and by verbal terminations they may be made more abstract. 154. From this it follows that we are able to come nearer and nearer to the pure intellect, and indeed, by means of universal ideas and a certain passive power, that as we remove particular ideas or withdraw the mind from limitations, from the more broken, limited, and material ideas, and at the same time from desires and loves, which are purely natural, then the human intellect, quiet and free from foreign disturbance, and dwelling alone with its own and what belongs to pure intellect, causes that our mind shall not suffer other changes or give forth other reasons than those which accord with the ideas of pure intellect. On this account our intellect experiences an inmost tranquility and joy, for then this concurrence appears like the influx of a certain light of intelligence, illuminating the whole sphere of thought, and in a kind of unanimity, I know not whence, it constrains the whole mind, and in mostly dictates what is true and good and what is false or evil. In this way our intellect is perfected by the maturing judgment, and if I may speak from theoretical anatomy itself, when the mind comes into this state, it is seen that then the simple medulla itself consists of simple fibers only, with a few vessels. For as many as are the simple fibers, so many are the intellectual rays of pure intellect. But as many as are the vessels, so many are the shades which darken the luminous or intellectual rays. But these observations are offered merely in passing. 155. From these things it already appears how the human intellect may be perfected, thus that in tender infancy there is none, that it may be increased in youth, perfected in adult age, that the judgment afterwards increases, while the genius or imagination decreases. For there can be no thought in infancy, and still less in the embryo, wherefore there is a concurrence, correspondence, or established harmony, but not influx. Use and cultivation will bring about the correspondence and harmony, since the pure intellect concurs with every perceived change. But still, whether in the embryo or in the infant, or in a stupid or an insane person, the pure intellect remains always the same, for it cannot unfold itself before it perceives the changes of state to which it shall correspond, nor can the sensory change its own states unless it shall learn how to do so by the use and the influx of the external sensations, as has been noted above. Thus the pure intellect comes forth and emerges just as from a prison in which it has been shut up, or from its own inmost bosom, according to the induced mutability or power of change. Thus appears what has been present from the beginning of formation, but could not sooner evolve itself, and when it does evolve itself, which takes place in the course of age, then it exhibits itself as most present in every instant, in the single forms and harmonies of words, and in finding out their inmost meaning from the connection and order of the ideas alone. 156. But experience itself, as well as theory, proves that the human intellect proper depends little upon its pure intellect, but rather upon what is imagined, and even that the imagination depends more upon its sensations than upon its own intellect or thought. Thence is our intellect exceedingly impure, so much so that it deserves rather to be called spurious and adulterous. Nevertheless, it appears to us so beautiful and pure that we believe it to be the soul itself, which is not pure intellect merely, but even spiritual intelligence. How mistaken all this is appears from the mere statement. Our intellect is even so alienated oft times from the pure intellect that they combat each other, the one acknowledging worldly things as truths, the other knowing them to be wholly mendacious, and that their fallacious ornaments pass them off for truths to gain applause. 157. Meanwhile, in order that the human intellect may exist, it is necessary that the truths themselves be variegated, and as it were modified by things mendacious, or true things with false, good with evil. From this mixed and relative variety, and this coming together of opposites, there arises a rational analysis. First, it gives birth to opinion, hypothesis, some unknown principle, and many other things proper to the human intellect. Without a variation of intelligence and ignorance, thought and judgment can no more exist than a visual image without light and shade, which is the reason why light and clearness are predicated of intelligence, and shade and darkness of ignorance, for these have a mutual correspondence. Without such a variation there would be no society on earth, no diversity of thought, manners, actions, bodies, no affirmations or negations, no uncertain results of things, no auguries, indeed, no desires of ends to be attained, no terrestrial loves, none of all those other things which as necessities contribute to human society itself. Neither would there be any speech or communication of thought by means of discourse, unless by some superior or angelic discourse which has nothing to do with earthly things. 158. The various kinds of insanity, which are infinite in number, originate from thence, that the states of the sensories are so perverted that they can undergo no changes except what are irregular and in disagreement with the pure intellect. And as the intellectory concurs with the changes of the sensory, it concurs by the same law even with these disorderly ones, and thus seems to consent, even though it wholly dissents. Thus it is the thought itself or the human intellect which is insane, and not the pure intellect. End of section 16.